All right, so I'm going to make a really quick painting of this little tiny shell. You notice how there's some dark areas, some shadows here, and there's some very light areas. So I'm going to start by creating my first layer, which is kind of like an underpainting. And so I'm going to think about what are some underlying colors that I'm going to put in this painting. And in my dark areas, I like to use a lot of purples and blues. So I'm actually going to start with purple. Even though the shell itself is not really purple, I'm going to use that as kind of the base layer that I'm going to build upon. Okay, and so I have one that's already started. So here is the quick sketch of my shell. I started by preparing some purple, but I made it very light. So I'm adding a lot more water to my purple. Kind of show you that. So here's my purple. I'm actually going in, I'm adding just a lot more water so that I'm soaking up my brush with this very watered down purple, because I don't want to start very dark. I'm eventually going to get dark, but right now I'm just going to go in and looking at my shell. I'm just going to paint in very lightly and very loosely, if you notice, just those areas of where I see some darks. I'm just blocking out areas of light and dark. Areas that are light, I'm not even painting. Okay? And that's the first layer. Now, because we don't want to oversaturate our paper, we need to make sure that we let each layer dry. So I'm going to take this layer, I'm just going to let it dry. I'm not going to do anything to it. So I have the next one down here. I have it already dried. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my next color. So the next layer, another color. And so because it's a shell, it has kind of like a pink interior. I'm going to take my red. I actually don't have any pink, but this is kind of like a pinky red. So I am going to add a whole bunch of water to that red. I'm going to saturate my brush. And then I'm going to add a layer of red on top of my purple. Okay, also very light. Notice how light it is. We're just going to get that very subtle tint of red. Once your brush, once you use up all the paint on your brush, you do have to go back and recharge your brush quite often, because you want to make sure that you're painting with enough paint. Again, this second layer is also really kind of loose. Oh, it's kind of rough. I'm not really paying that close attention to my edges yet. Okay, and so that's the second layer. Let that dry. My next layer, I have a whole bunch that I've kind of started here. Now that I have two layers and I have some color built up, here's an example of one that has both the kind of very subtle purple and the very subtle pink. Now I'm going to start to go in and add some more definition, some darker values, and really kind of paying close attention to detail. Okay, so I'm going to go in, I'm going to make sure that this was a very light purple. I want this to be much darker. So I'm going to go in and put in my darks now. I do not have any black, so I am actually going to mix my dark color using purple, using a dark brown, and a dark blue. If I wanted it to be less purple, I would probably put a little bit more brown, but I think I'm okay with it being a little bit purple. Okay, so I have a nice dark color that I'm going to go in and put in my dark shadows. So now I'm being much more careful with my edges and making sure that I have some clean edges where the edges need to be kind of crisp. Notice that this area here is white. I have not painted there. So any area that is white, you don't just don't paint. You're leaving it the white of the paper. Okay. Now I can, in this area, since it's fairly dark, I do want it to have some variation, so I'm going to go back in with some blues and some other just dark colors that I can hide within this dark shadow. And I'm going to use the wet on wet technique, where I'm just going to touch, 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 touch. So I have some nice darks. And now I'm starting to get more intensity of color. Now, if I want to blend out any colors, I can use just, this is a clean brush, no water or no paint, just water. I can use that water, that clean brush, to blend out some of these dark areas. Notice how I'm kind of encouraging the paint to blend a little bit here. Okay? Same thing here. It's dark here. If I want to kind of create a little bit like a graded wash, I'm just using a clean brush and then just drawing that color down. There. Okay. There's a bit of a shadow here. I'm going to let some of that blue kind of bleed over because I actually like it when it bleeds a bit. Now this area has a little bit too much water, so I'm going to dry off my brush. I'm going to use my brush as like a sponge to soak up some of that water. There we go. Okay. Now, this area here, this top part of the shell has some lines and some more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get some kind of a darker color, use the very tip of my brush, and I'm going to use the wet on dry technique where I'm just, this area is completely dry, and so I'm going to add some texture and some detail with these lines. And I know that it's not going to bleed into the background because I've let that background completely dry. So this line is a little bit too much of a line, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend it out again using clean water, a damp brush, and I can dissolve the paint that's there, and I can use that to kind of fade that edge and that value out so that it's a more of a subtle gradient. Okay? So that's how you create this idea of complex colors, where you have these layers of colors that are kind of put together, where we read it as a whole, but there's all these kind of parts that go into making that whole. It makes it a much more interesting, varied surface. It gives it more dimension, it gives it more depth, visual interest. I added a little bit of orange there just because, again, it's a shell and it has like a little bit of a pinky hue, but you can really experiment with the different colors that you can hide within your paintings.